Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm a spring migrant to North America. My wife, who studies primates in Kenya, has an adjunct position in University of California, San Diego. So as part of our marriage pact halfway around the world, I come to the US in spring, also do some adjunct teaching in the University of California, San Diego. But my route has never taken me through Arkansas, so it's a great pleasure to be here today. What I'd like to do is talk about wildlife as something different. To talk about wildlife ownership and who owns wildlife. Now, in order to do that, you have to get involved in politics. And being very naive when I began life in conservation, I didn't realize that. And so I've been very heavy-footed throughout my career, gradually stepping into more and more politics without realizing who owns wildlife was very central to that issue. And so what I want to do is take you back on a long journey, which is really partly my own life, but to show in part where wildlife originates. Wildlife in the sense of the big dramatic herds of Serengeti and Amboseli, but how they relate to, I think, increasingly the world ahead of us. And it might seem a very nebulous connection, but I'll try and show you how they do connect up. I began life hunting elephants on the elephant trail in Tanzania. My father left Britain when he was a young man. He went to India. He was interested in hunting tigers. He left India, and during the war, he ended up in Kenya. And he got very interested in wildlife, but chasing wildlife, hunting elephants. And so I grew up on the elephant trail, where what really counted wasn't Dumbo the elephant, but how big tusks an elephant had. And the thing that every hunter wanted to kill was a 100-pound elephant. And that, to me, was what life was all about when I was 6, 7, 8 years old. And it was a great thrill to lose ourselves in the middle of Africa, go hunting, and to meet local hunters. And this told me something that was very important, that hunting was not something anomalous. It's where we, as a human species, began. And so I didn't learn from other hunters who used rifles. I learned from local hunters. And throughout my life, what's really impressed me most is how this connection with wildlife is where we began. And as we've evolved, as we've developed, we've forgotten those root connections. Why is that important? Because to me, the African hunter who I grew up with had an intimate connection with wildlife. And they sustain wildlife like no other people have anywhere on Earth. So what does that mean? That when most of you go to East Africa, to Serengeti, to Masai Mara, to Amboseli, you think this is the last of the wild. It isn't. It's actually the oldest hunting estate on Earth. And likewise, it's the oldest ranch on Earth. Because people like the Maasai developed their own livestock and evolved with their own livestock in situ. So what does this really mean? As I was growing up, my father switched from being a hunter to being concerned about the future wildlife. That wildlife, the last of the herds anywhere on Earth, the great herds, was disappearing. Why? Because there were more people. Commercial hunting came into East Africa, whereas before it was subsistence hunting. So I began to see him as a 14-year-old, as I was 14 years old, switch from hunting elephants to conserving elephants. And I began to see the first of the national park movements in East Africa, where my father was very involved in setting aside Mikumi National Park, as it's now become, in Tanzania. Areas to protect wildlife from people. From who? From people. People who had always lived with wildlife. And so this seemed to be something of an anomaly. Here I'd grown up with African hunters, and I'd seen that they had a great deal of ability to follow wildlife and to maintain wildlife herds, and that everywhere you went in Africa, there was wildlife and people. There was no separation of people and wildlife. So it was somewhat of a shock to me as a young teenager to see suddenly areas set aside for wildlife alone and separate from people. And growing up speaking Swahili, I heard the downside of that, which many people didn't. Those areas became known as shamba la bibi. There's a Kenyan here, and he'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Shamba la bibi in Kiswahili means the farm of a woman. That woman happened to be the Queen of England. Here we are in the middle of Africa, a piece of land setting aside for the Queen of England in order that she may conserve those animals which African peoples had always lived with. The giraffe is a beautiful animal. It became known as the royal animal. Why? Because it has beautiful eyebrows. For any of you who look closely at a giraffe, look twice. It has absolutely exquisite eyebrows, which will put any of you to shame who've got mascara on your own eyes. It was so exquisite it became a royal animal, protected from hunting, even from traditional hunters. So I was concerned that while clearly bushmeat was increasing, commercial hunting was increasing, animals were under pressure, the idea of setting aside a national park for the exclusive use of animals was almost the antithesis of what African coexistence between people and wildlife was all about. So going back to the University of Nairobi, I purposely chose an area which had not yet become a national park. That was Amboseli, where the Maasai and the wildlife were still abundant, and they still coexisted. I was not constrained academically by any European or American university to study zoology or anthropology or economics. I was able to study whatever took my fancy, being at the University of Nairobi. So I included people as a part of the environment, a part of the ecosystem. And for a year period, I went out and I measured animals. I flew over the herds. I looked at where they went. I looked at population numbers and find out how they moved around in relation to resources. And this is what struck me most, which resonated with what I saw as a kid. Wherever wildlife went, livestock went as well. They moved at the same time, the same places. Now, at first, this was rather an academic question. Why are Maasai moving around in the same way that wildlife do? And it wasn't until one day a Maasai came up to me and said, "Why are you counting these animals?" And I said, "To find out what they're doing." And he said to me, "Why don't you ask us? We know exactly what they're doing." So I said, "Fine," and I began to ask. And I was surprised at the depth of knowledge. Now, I want to ask you to think about something. There's a book called The Ecological Indian, which is trying to reconstruct what the North American Indian thought about the environment and how they behaved in relation to the environment. Were they environmentalists or not? In Africa, we have hundreds of different ethnic groups who are still living cheek by jowl with nature, and you can ask exactly those questions, whether they live within limits. You don't have to ask that question of the ecological Indian. My most advantageous step was this. The particular Maasai I was involved in said, "Rather than us tell you what's going on, why don't we give you cattle? And you can see Amboseli through the eyes of a cow. Then you will understand what it's about." So they gave me cattle, and I had the delightful 1 or 2 years where I had Sotwa and Matingab, and I had to herd these around with the Maasai cattle. And what I found very quickly is that we were moving alongside the herds of wild animals. And the Maasai, in this case, Kerankol, Olipurdul, and others, didn't have to tell me what was going on. I knew what the wildebeest was doing. I knew why it was moving where it was moving to get the best grazing. I knew how it grazed and how to distinguish what zebra did from what wildebeest did. And very quickly, I saw that the Maasai were exploiting cattle, sheep, and goat as though they were wild animals in exactly the same way. And so how did they end up with migrations which were so similar? Well, very simply this. They have the ultimate assay, bioassay, which is called the kibuyu in Kiswahili. I think you know what I'm talking about, where women are every night milking cattle into that gourd. And if what the cattle has done that day is a good strategy, they get more milk. If what they've done is a bad strategy, they get less milk, and they have a harder time for their family. So it takes no time at all using the kibuyu, the gourd, as a bioassay to figure out what is a good strategy to move cattle around the landscape. And I suspect it took very little time indeed for the pastoralists to figure that out. Now, a second thing happens when you figure out that following animals is the best way to get high milk productivity. The second thing you do is actually deploy scouts from among the Maasai and other herders to find out where the animals are going, where they're migrating to. because you figure out they're going to get to the best places before you do, and all you have to do is work out where they're going, and you end up at the same place. So to cut a long story short, seeing amboseli through the eyes of a cow was an ecological lesson like I've never had through science. But what was important is that my science was able to tell me that that strategy was a good and effective strategy. And ultimately, the combination of local knowledge and scientific knowledge showed me that there is such a thing as coexistence between people and wildlife. Now, how do we arrive at this conclusion? When I say that East Africa is the oldest cattle ranch on Earth, the pastoralists have been there for about 3.5, maybe 4,000 years. And yet, unlike the American West, the African grasslands have sustained themselves over those 3.5, 4,000 years. They support the densest and the richest wildlife populations on Earth. Serengeti, Masai Mara, Amboseli, Samburu, I could go on. Each one of those areas has clearly been sustained over generations. Pastoralism is the sustainable strategy. Now, another reason it's sustainable goes back to a message I want to bring out at the very end. Husbandry. If you as a pastoralist in the savannas are trying to manage against the most effective and competitive array of species anywhere, the zebra, the wildebeest, the dik-dik, and the elephant, how do you manage? Through your cattle, through milk production, and finding out that husbandry is the basis of sustainability. If you don't maintain your herds, you don't maintain your families, and those two are intimately connected. And so over time, husbandry is the route through to ecological understanding. Because in order to understand what the cow is doing, you need to understand what the cow is eating, what the predator of the cow is, what the disease of the cow is. And it's a lesson in ecological integrity. Now, it's not surprising that Aldo Leopold, in a very forgotten quote, says the basis of conservation is husbandry. Because it's only through husbandry of the animal that you learn about the environment that the animal needs to sustain it. And because you are trying to maintain, in the long term, the productivity of your herd, husbandry is the route through to conservation understanding. So I'm going to drop that there and bring it up again in the end when I come to globalization. Enough to say this, that having really understood very clearly the reason why there was coexistence, I was able to parlay that into a new ecological strategy. That maintaining mobility of herds, of wildlife and livestock, is the basis of productivity. Because the more they move and keep on green areas, the higher their productivity. And the more they move and are able to move around each other, the less competition there is between livestock and wildlife. So the basis is space, mobility, and seasonality. Now, there's one other point that I want to bring in, which has to do with long-term sustainability. Garrett Hardin, in his book, The Tragedy of the Commons, uses pastoralists, and he probably had the Maasai in mind, as people who overuse the rangelands. Why? Because every herder is free to move exactly where he wants. He moves to the best grazing, he uses it all up, because he gains an advantage, and everyone else suffers the cost. Does that really work? We know today that isn't the case. Why? Because pastoralism has sustained the savannas over thousands of years. And the reason comes down to the social network of people. There is no such thing as the open commons in pastoral rangelands. Those areas are owned and they're designated by the pastoralists. And there's a network of clans. There's a whole system of cattle associates where I give you cattle, you give me cattle, and we have a reciprocal arrangement. And over time, you build up a network which is so, if you like, coherent, that areas can be set aside in the dry season. These are drought refuges. Now, these drought refuges, no one will touch. They are left until such time as they had a bad year. I wish we'd used in the global financial crisis. We didn't. I come back to that too. So my point is this. Garrett Hardin was right in the global commons that everyone will use up anything they can, even at the expense of other people. But the moment you have an overlay of a social network, you begin to change the relationship between people and environment. And as soon as you have husbandry, where you're trying to maintain your herd in the long run, and you're trying to maintain it through a network of other people, you have an entirely different relationship between people and environment. Let me now take that forward to the next stage. How do you change the concept of a national park and integrate it into a larger ecosystem? We were able to use the World Bank and the Kenya government to argue for a change of policy where national parks were essential but insufficient because they didn't protect the wet season migrations. And over time, we were able to bring a new policy of Kenya that said, consistent with the direction things were going nationally, that local people must also benefit from wildlife. We shouldn't set up an enclave economy where a national park is only a part of an ecosystem and part of an economy. Revenue should go back to the ultimate custodians who had maintained it over time. Now, in the dust of Kilimanjaro, you'll find a long history of how we developed this through the Kenya government. My point here is to say that we're going back to a pre-existing ownership of wildlife, because the Maasai during droughts considered wildlife their second cattle, to be used in times of drought when their own cattle gave out. So I was able to use that idea of second cattle at a national level to argue that if we re-involve local people through the national policy, we broke away from the enclave of a restricted national park. We were able to work at a much larger ecosystem level. We were able to increase, if you like, the volume of tourism, to decrease the concentration inside the national parks, and so on. I think you get the idea. What I'm trying to do is shift back from the separation of people, lands, and wildlife to a much more inclusive approach. So in 1977, this became a national policy for Kenya, that wildlife must, as it did in the past, earn its way. That we should aim not for a strict protection policy and a restricted national park, but an ecosystem approach. Has that worked? Amboseli was about the only place in Kenya during the great ivory hunting days, the poaching days, where elephants actually increased after this locally based conservation approach came into effect. So between 1970 and 1989, Kenya's elephant population went down from 140 to about 19,000. That's how rapidly elephants are disappearing. Amboseli in 1977, when it introduced the locally based conservation and the involvement of local people, saw elephants which had collapsed from 1,500 down to 500, climb back up to 700, 1,000, today to about 1,600. It didn't take any extra security forces. All it took is local people being involved. And I'll come on to that in a moment. I now want to go to elephants in particular and show how you scale up from a local level to an international level. Elephants are iconic. They're iconic in the West because you think about them as Dumbo, you think about them as wonderful creatures. In Africa, for many people, they mean the loss of a seasonal crop. They mean a loss of a relative, because elephants are also dangerous. So elephants have two faces, like Janus. They're an international icon, but also they're locally they're the biggest threat to people. We lose about 55 people every year to elephants. So in 1977, because Amboseli was very successful, what happened is what's happened over much of Africa. Elephants were heavily poached, and they began to retreat into the sanctuary of Amboseli National Park. And so one of the reasons we set up Amboseli to conserve biodiversity was now threatened by the concentration of elephants. And we've lost about 30% of our bird species and a large percentage of our plant species as a result of the over-concentration of elephants fleeing from people. So in 1981, I was asked by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature to look into the fate of the African elephant. And we undertook a 3-year study which involved 30 different people looking at all aspects of the ivory trade and what was happening to the African elephant in terms of different threats, from habitat loss, from the ivory trade, and so forth. And the picture was very clear. Elephants were threatened not by what was happening in Africa, but by an international community. Had I come here 10 years ago, I would have seen people wearing ivory bangles and bracelets. So unknown to you, your demand in the US was having an adverse impact in Africa. It was creating an ivory war between rangers and local poachers. There is an international connection which involves the fate of our elephants. So over the next few years, I became very involved through IUCN in trying to negotiate, to broker an international agreement which would recognize the importance of elephants locally, but stem the ivory trade. And this involved coming here to the US, speaking at various commissions, traveling to Japan, traveling to Hong Kong and various other places, and getting across the message that elephants are valuable to Africa, but also they're an international symbol. How do we reconcile these two? Through the international trade in ivory, through the working group on ivory, we're able to come up with a variety of scenarios which would conserve the elephant on a local basis, but also close the trade. And in 1989, the international ivory trade was closed for, can I get some water? The international trade at CITES was caught between the tensions of the African countries which wanted to continue, if you like, an ivory trade illegitimately, and the international community which wanted to stop the ivory trade. Under the CITES international trade, the ultimate solution was to upgrade the elephant to Appendix 1 and to introduce an international ban, but to allow a downgrade to Appendix 2 in the event that African countries were able to demonstrate managed populations of elephants. And ultimately, there was a downlisting of the South African countries, the Southern African countries, where they managed ivory sustainably. Now, the point about the international trade is that you and I have a big impact on elephants in Africa. It's no longer a local species. So who owns the elephant? Who owns wildlife? There was a book written in 1981 about the United States. Who owns wildlife? And it was a political and economic history of wildlife in the 18th century. And the point that it made is this, that you in North America had a huge debate about the ownership of wildlife. Your reaction was to the royal ownership, the aristocratic ownership of wildlife that had been in Europe for many hundreds of years, where the peasant was denied access to wildlife. And so what came about in the US was a balance between the national interest, the federal government, the local interests, and strictly democratic rights to wildlife. And what you have in the US today is a balance of different interests. Every person has the right to use wildlife, to hunt wildlife, under license and in closed season, but the regulation is at a state level, state by state. In the event of an endangered species, the wolf, the equivalent to our elephant, it comes under a federal regulation, the Endangered Species Act. So you've balanced off different interests. So put yourself back in the African context. Who owns wildlife? How do we balance off local and national interests? In 1994, I was asked by the president to become director of Kenya Wildlife Service to resolve the issue of conflict between people and wildlife. Why? Because although Amboseli had moved ahead and become a very effective model internationally of community-based conservation, nothing had been done to introduce similar approaches elsewhere. It was an isolated case. The question of who owned wildlife was still in the Kenyan mind. It's owned by government. So let me give you just a couple of examples to indicate how pervasive this was. Among Maasai, traditionally, the wildlife which was used in dry seasons and during droughts was called Ng'ombe ya pili, which means our second cattle. During dry periods, they use wildlife to reestablish their own herds, or until such time as they reestablish their own herds. Under the colonial governments and under independent governments, those same ng'ombe ya pili, our second cattle, became ng'ombe ya serikali. That's government cattle, owned by the government, owned by the Queen of England. So under Kenya Wildlife Service, we introduced a new approach. And again, I want to go back to the history of conservation in the US. Yellowstone was the first national park established in 1872. Who was it established for? The American citizen. Who have Kenya's parks been for? Who have Zimbabwe's parks been for? Overseas visitors, foreigners, not Kenyans. I took a cue from Yellowstone National Park, 1872. What created the citizen-driven approach in the US was providing access to your national parks, providing railheads to Yellowstone, providing access to Yosemite and other areas. And I looked very carefully at what had happened in the US and used the same approach in Kenya. On the 50th anniversary of national parks, we opened our national parks free of charge to Kenyans and developed the slogan, Parks for Kenyans. Now, we had an extraordinary scene in which Kenyans were turning up in Mercedes-Benzes into national parks because they thought these were for overseas people, not for Kenyans. They could afford it, but to make sure they really understood they could afford it, we then lowered the fees from what had been 200 or 300 shillings down to 100 shillings and down to 50 shillings for Kenyans. And we had a free day for Kenyans from there on. And from that time onwards, we saw the number of Kenyans entering areas like Nakuru climb from less than 5% to over 50% today, where young kids coming out of school are taking hold of their parents and saying, why are we going and looking at films of wildlife in Nakuru Township when we could be taking you into the national park at such a low rate? And I wish I could show you some of the photographs of 18, 19, 20 Kenyans piling into a minibus way over the legal limit, going in to see their wildlife. Parks for Kenyans. These slogans are very important. Who owns wildlife? Well, of course, Kenyans. But we have to make sure that Kenyans really are the legitimate, if you like, users of wildlife too. Now let me go back to community-based conservation. Unless you also stimulate, if you like, the demand among local peoples, community-based conservation is going nowhere. It's not enough to say, you own wildlife. What use is that if an elephant comes into your shamba, your field, and destroys your crop at night? How do you turn an elephant to advantage? The way in which we did it was create another slogan, and it was called Parks Beyond Parks. In other words, to take the idea of a national park, but to create a community park or a sanctuary. And we began that in 1995 under the same slogan. And between 1995 and today, we haven't added on a single acre of new national park. We have added on, you'll have to help me with kilometers to miles, we've added on about 5,000 extra square kilometers of land under community wildlife sanctuaries. That's about 2,000 square miles. Why? Because local communities everywhere now understand that they have the legitimate right to create a legal entity, a wildlife association, and they are given legal standing. And that legal standing allows them to set aside their own wildlife sanctuary and to go into deals with tour operators, to invite in conservationists, and to establish ecotourism lodges. And these ecotourism lodges are built by local people, they're run by local people. They establish their own scouts who are trained by Kenya Wildlife Service. They have their own radio communication systems, so they keep out the poacher. And that means they generate money. And here's the interesting thing. They have not tried to separate wildlife and livestock. What they've done is recreate the drought refuge that I talked about earlier, where areas which are important late dry season for livestock are now validated legally as a wildlife sanctuary. So during good years, they're generating lots of money from tourism, and you as a tourist can go in and walk with local people and look at wildlife close up. But at the same time, they are reserved late season for livestock. And so we find side by side two different areas in Kenya today. One in Namanga, which is on the Tanzania border, and another one in Magadi, which is between Amboseli and Masai Mara. In the last drought, the Masai in the Namanga area lost 60% of their livestock, and they had very little grazing left. The Masai in the southern rift, who set aside the sanctuaries and the conservancies, lost about 15% of their livestock. They have a lot of wildlife, and they're generating very good income. And those same scouts have now become, if you like, the pasture monitors. They're going out and looking at pastures and trying to convince people to conserve what it is they have for their livestock and for the wildlife. So that's my message, that it's not enough to give people the rights to use wildlife. You have to create institutions. You have to create associations. You have to give the legal, legitimate right. How does it relate to the modern world? In the Southwest, and I was reading a book coming over about the Dust Bowl in the US, where you broke sod back in the 1930s in areas which had been the greatest bison grounds anywhere. Support about 35 million bison, which of course were then exterminated in the 1880s. When that was turned over to agriculture, the land became degraded, denuded, and dust bowls. But long before that, in the 1920s, 1910, 1920s, further south, the cowboys had already overused the range, they'd overgrazed it. Why? Because they had subdivided the land into small holdings. They weren't able to live off those small plots. And therefore, with the demand for beef and overstocking, they degraded the range. Today in Malpai, this is an area on the Arizona-New Mexico border, they have formed an association called the Malpai Borderlands Group. They've created a legal entity among the landowners, here among the cowboys, the second oldest on earth, not the oldest, and they have tried to conserve their land by doing what? By setting aside a grass bank, big areas which during droughts can be used for their own livestock, and also to restore their land after generations of degradation. I think you can begin to see there are two different stories going on the opposite sides of the world. So what do you do as a conservationist? What I did was got the two cowboys together, the Maasai from East Africa and the cowboys from the Southwest, for over-the-horizon learning, to see over the horizon what they couldn't possibly see from their own experience. So from the point of view of the Maasai, every Maasai now wants to subdivide his land into 100 acres, 200 acres, because that will give them ownership of that land and make sure other people can't steal it. That's the biggest fear, losing the land. But what they're beginning to realize is that they too will suffer land degradation. They don't have an experience of that. They never have. So what I did was bring the Maasai to meet the cowboys of North America and look at the impact of land degradation and what effect that would have. And then in meeting the Malpai, they saw that the Malpai cowboys were forming associations similar to what they, the Maasai, had. So they said, aha, but we already have this long history of collaboration about how to manage the land, about setting aside grass banks. So why don't you come back to Kenya and we'll show you how to form associations of people and networks of people. So we've created an exchange back and forth between Kenya and the Southwest about how to maintain grasslands, how to set aside grass banks, how to create associations of people that think about much bigger landscapes. This is what we call over-the-horizon learning. It's experience beyond your horizon. Now, I want to end with why I think this is particularly important in the global world today. If there's one lesson that I've learned, it's that when people are localized and have been there for a long period of time, like the Maasai, like the Kung, like the Mabuti pygmies in the Ituri forest and so on, is that there is a close connection between the social entity and the environment. Because everyone, sooner or later, if they use the environment, will have a catastrophe and their society will go bust. Whereas other societies which are looking further ahead and trying to conserve the resources will do better. So here's the message. In looking back over time, conservation is the most extraordinary thing we as a species have ever done. Can you think of any other entity in human activity which will say, let's conserve not just other species, but all other species, biodiversity? Biodiversity is not a natural thing to conserve. It is anti-Darwinian. Elephants and amboseli are not thinking about conserving other species. They're smashing up woodlands, and 30% of other species have gone extinct. Why is it that uniquely we're thinking about conserving biodiversity? So let me go back to this beginnings. The Maasai have reciprocity, social reciprocity, a strong link between action and consequence. And again, I want to make that point, action and consequence. If I do something bad to my neighbor, it's not just my neighbor who responds, but it's the rest of the clan. I am shamed. I am forced to do what is right and not what is wrong. But the same thing happens environmentally. If I move into that grass bank early and I use it, I am reprimanded by the whole society because it's in the interest of everyone to maintain that resource. And it's only possible because of the intimate connection between people, society, and environment. So let me end up with this message. How on earth can you conserve biodiversity when no other species has even thought about it? When throughout history, everything we've done has been to remove big, dangerous animals, not to conserve them. North America is the best case. 12,500 years ago, you lost your mega mammals. Why conserve biodiversity? Well, fortunately, I'm in an audience that knows why. The question is how. We know that biodiversity is important for resilience of environments. We know it's important, as some people are doing here right next door to us, trying to maintain the genetic variety of different breeds and stocks. We know that biodiversity is going to be increasingly important in maintaining areas like the forests and the oceans because of global warming. You're even going as far as to use carbon credits to be able to pay people in the Amazon to protect their forests. Wildlife is becoming a global ownership issue. You're beginning to use new mechanisms to conserve biodiversity. But how do you forego the benefits now in order to conserve in the long term? Conservation is about forbearance. It's about foregoing now in order to have a larger benefit in future. And I want to come back in closing to the idea that Aldo Leopold raised 60 years ago, husbandry. You probably think that the idea of custodianship is new, that it came about in the last 20, 30 years when we realized that we can destroy the entire planet unless we become custodians of the planet itself. It isn't new. It comes out of husbandry. And it comes out of the husbandry which starts with the Maasai, with the Kung, and with many other people, where by managing their herds, they realize they have to manage the environment on which those herds depend, the water, the soils, the pastures. And so I want to leave you with this message, that husbandry is one of the oldest things that we have done in conservation. That's where conservation begins during the Neolithic. We conserve things because they were immediately important to us, and by working as a group together, like the Maasai do, that entire group is able to forego immediate benefits from wildlife now through domestication, forego for 1 year, 2 years the reproduction of their herds, and to get a larger gain in future. That's the direct analogy of what we're trying to do at the global level today. What's missing? The link between action and consequence. A Maasai, a bushman, can see things at a glance all around him. Today, when you go into a supermarket, when I go into a supermarket, and I buy something off the shelf, I have no idea who that affects and where or how. And we know the Nike effect of child labor in different countries. We know that our refrigerators were having a big effect on the ozone hole. So I'm going to ask you to stretch your minds. How do you reconnect action and consequence? I would say there's not a chance except for one thing, and that's the global communication age and the young generation of kids we're looking at here today, right? Because they have the internet, they have Blackberries, they have certification about whether or not woods are sustainable, whether ecotourism does good for local people. We're beginning to develop a series of techniques of certification where we know the impact that something will have. But ultimately, there's only one thing that's going to make any difference, and that's 6.75 million people who have the same information that a Maasai or a Kung person has about the impact that they have halfway across the world or 20 or 30 years into the future. The solution is transparency and information. Now, if we had transparency and information, would we be in the state that we're in financially and through the financial markets today? I want to leave you this one thought. Garrett Hardin was wrong when he said the pastoralists will over-destroy his land. But he was right about the financial markets, because that's exactly what they're doing. The financial markets rush to the area of the highest return, and there's no connection, if you like, between the larger populace. They can't see the consequences of their impact. So visibility, transparency, connection, action and consequence. It applies equally to our environment, and it applies equally to our global financial crisis. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. Please raise your hand. We have 2 mics roaming around. We'll pass you a mic, and then we'll pass you the mic to ask the question. So, any questions? Start off with? Sir.
I can't pass up the chance because it's not often that you have a fellow Kenyan coming to give a lecture. So thank you so much, Dr. Weston. It was a treat listening to you. The last time I listened to you was 27 years ago, and you haven't lost the passion. If anything, it's more intense. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I just wanted to ask, what is the status now of the elephant population in Kenya? Is it declining overall, or is it still the same?
The elephant population in Kenya is increasing. It's one of the good news stories. The population, as I said, went down from 144,000 to 19,000 by the time the ivory ban came into effect. It's now climbed up to a little over 30,000. Most of the elephants left at the time of the ivory ban were confined to national parks. Over 2/3 of the elephants today are outside national parks. The new community sanctuaries we set up between Amboseli and Masai Mara, there you find the communities actively inviting elephants into their landscape. We put satellite collars onto the elephants and have now shown they've successfully negotiated across the landscape, and they discovered these new wildlife sanctuaries. And the Maasai actively invite them because they're good for tourism. But there's another interesting point that's coming out about the elephant. The elephant is a landscape species. The Maasai say that elephants create grasslands, livestock create bushlands through overgrazing. And so what they're realizing that when they lost the elephant, and you only had cattle, they tended to overgraze in one location, and you had thick bush encroachment, and rather like the Malpai down in the southwest, you lost your grasslands. And what they're discovering is that by the elephant coming back in and actively inviting the elephant, they're opening up the thickets and recreating grasslands. And so what we're trying to do in many of the areas outside parks is recreate what we call the ecological minuet, where elephants and people always moved around the landscape, but in a different tempo. Elephants opening up landscapes here and moving on, livestock moving in to take advantage of the grasslands they had created. So that idea of coexistence has a very deep history. And all it comes down to a point that Nikolai mentioned earlier, that perturbations and disturbance are an important part of what we do on the human landscape. So long as our disturbance is short-term, it's got to be productive. Once it becomes long-term and permanent and unsustainable, then it's not. So the story of elephants for me and what's happened in Kenya is that we can support much bigger elephant populations, but only if we reintroduce them in a way back into the human ecological landscape.
You right there, sir. Start with you. Right there. Start with
What effect is the press of human population going to have on your hypothesis here?
When our kids were very young, I learned a very important lesson about conservation. You know those little bricks that you get and you try and slot them one into another? The one thing you don't do in conservation is put a square peg into a round hole. You don't try and do conservation in an area where it's impossible because either the density of people is too great or it's a primary area of production for people. Best example is a city or the most productive areas in the US. Those are not areas for conservation. How does that apply to Africa? We're going through a tremendous rural to urban migration, similar to what you had in the US in the 1800s, where you switch from an agrarian population to an urban population. Within 30, 40 years, that transition will have largely taken place in Kenya and much of Africa in future. What we're looking at is a 30 to 40 year period in which population will be a really egregious problem for conservation. And so during that period of time, what we've got to do is find areas where we can make the best fit between people and wildlife now. We can make wildlife more valuable as a part of the landscape rather than eliminating it. At bottom, I would guess that we can conserve about 30% of the Kenya landscape for people and wildlife together. 70%, we're probably going to lose. Further down the line, once we got beyond the population crunch, I think that there's a real opportunity, as we've seen in South Africa, that we could reintroduce wildlife back into the landscape where people have moved out into the urban areas. And in South Africa today, that population problem in a lot of the landscape has evaporated. People, let me just give one example. Kruger National Park had too many animals, overstocked. So instead of cropping at one stage, they sold them to private ranchers who wanted to reintroduce wildlife into the landscape. So long as there's a market, so long as you're not trying to put wildlife into the problems of the highest population growth and density, I think there's an enormous amount of room. And it goes beyond what I call the 10% solution. The 10% solution is what we would get if we had national parks only. If we find means of integrating wildlife on a much bigger landscape and ecosystem level, at a landscape level, there are any number of new mechanisms that will make it in the interest of landowners to conserve wildlife. I'll just give you one final example. Outside Masai Mara, and you've probably seen this in the press in the last few days, people have been losing wildlife. Why? Because settlement is moving south. But those same ranchers have gone into an agreement with the tour operators and the conservationists to set aside conservancies. And within the conservancies, they're relocating their own villages so that they can make a bigger area available for livestock and wildlife together. And now by relocating, there's a community to get all the social services, education, health clinics that they need that they can't get in a dispersed rural population. And then they leave this larger arena of the conservancy for livestock and wildlife. So I'm not pessimistic. I should be. But I actually think we're just at the beginning of a huge battery of new techniques and approaches. But all of it comes down to one single thing. And that's turning a passion for conservation, which is what I have and I began with, to compassion, recognizing that other people suffer from wildlife where we love them. And so long as you can accommodate their compassion and offset the cost to them, I think the scope is pretty good, even within Africa.
right there.
There's somebody like you in West Africa, let's say Chad, Niger, Nigeria, or the south of Africa in Angola?
Sorry, I didn't say again.
Okay, is it somebody like you who is doing what you're doing in West Africa, let's say Chad, Niger, Nigeria, or in south of Africa, let's say Angola?
Thank goodness no. And I say that with all humility because I do not believe in eco-warrior, all right? I believe the eco-warrior is inimical to conservation because so long as you have the savior out there, it becomes like aid. You create dependency. That person will save our wildlife. My belief is that you have to create a movement. Now, what I did in community-based conservation, even though I became known as the grandfather of community-based conservation, is we held here in Early House in Virginia a meeting which brought together communities from all over the world, fishing communities, ranching, forestry, as well as the World Bank. We had many different World Wildlife Fund and other such agencies and said, what is community-based conservation? What is it about? How do we create a movement for community-based conservation? And so I think what's happened since then is you've seen new institutions, new organizations, and dozens of individuals getting involved because they know they can have a role, they can have an impact. It doesn't require one person anymore. Think about health. What put me onto this is small habits. So long as we depend on one eco-warrior, we're not going to save the world. So long as we depend on 6.75 billion people to do the right thing, we can do conservation. Now, my analogy is healthcare. Washing your hands, you do as a matter of course. Why do you do it? Because you know it's healthy. You didn't know that back in the 1840s, before we learned about germs, but we've learned about it today, and it's not only a normal habit, it's expected. And certainly in this day of swine fever, if you don't do it, you become socially stigmatized. That's my point about conservation. Conservation has to be something that is so automatic and so embedded that we do it as a matter of course, and we don't look to the eco-warrior to do it. So one of the things I've tried to do, quite honestly, is work my way out of business. And the day in which I can say, I can hang up my spurs on the wall over there and walk away and go back and enjoy the wildlife I spent my entire life trying to conserve, then I'm ahead of the game.
One more question. Itesbro?
Thank you very much. I'm a student at this school. I want to ask you, while conservation is working in Kenya because the Maasais are nomads, can it also work in an area like Uganda? Because I come from Uganda, and for us we don't have nomads except northern part of Uganda. Now, the government also recently came with a policy of removing communities from areas where they are encroached, like on the slopes of Mount Elgon.
Yes.
They are being thrown out. Yeah. They have nowhere to go because of population boom. They were forced to go in those protected areas. So the government is trying to protect those areas where the animals are, like national parks in the western part of Uganda. We have the where Mwea Safari Lodge is Queen Elizabeth National Park. A few years ago, people tried to enter the national park, but they were forcefully thrown out, and it caused a lot of commotion and confusion. So I want to know how conservation can work in communities which are not nomadic. Can it really work?
So the question is, can conservation work in communities where they're not nomadic? Yes, they certainly can. I think the reason why the pastoralists are nomadic is because they're living in a very dry area. And it's actually much more productive to be nomadic than it is to be sedentary. That's why wildebeest and zebra migrate in Serengeti, because they get an energy bonus from being migratory. And they get about 30% more production by being migratory than being sedentary. The same as the Palearctic migrant birds that move from Europe to Africa. So how could you make open up the opportunity for sedentary communities. Back in December, I was invited to a workshop in Tanzania called Travelers Philanthropy. It was how to get travelers to be philanthropic and to help local communities of conservation. And I had the pleasure of meeting up again with Wangari Maathai, the Nobel laureate for Kenya. Now, Wangari Maathai and I started off at the University of Nairobi exactly the same time, both doing our thesis. I think we both got the PhDs from the University of Nairobi at the same time. What we found in common was quite extraordinary. We'd gone different routes. But Wangari Maathai has done an amazing job since then in realizing that local people matter. Planting trees, making planting trees a political issue, making it about the rights of local people. So it's not surprising she got the Nobel Prize for linking environment and people. And one thing that she and many other people have done very effectively in Kenya, and I think this could happen many other places, is make forests a political issue. Now, don't forget that in Kenya, President Moi tried to de-gazette 120,000 hectares of land and give it to, essentially, other communities than the local ones. And there was a huge reaction to that forests are ours. They identified with the local forests. Secondly, forests are not important for shambas. They're important for water catchment. They're important for clean water. They're important for irrigation. They're important for fuel wood. So what you've got all over Kenya today is a very strong local community, sedentary community, of people who are committed to their own forest. And I think that's the type of connection you have to make as well. The worst enemy, I think, of Uganda and many other places is the outside world, saying you must have your national parks, which eliminate people and any involvement with local people. And I battled many, many years, quite honestly, with many different groups coming into Kenya and saying there should be no discussion and no debate about something I feel very strongly about, hunting. I gave up hunting when I was 16. I've never hunted since, and I don't want to hunt again. But I think it is the legitimate right of Kenyans and Ugandans to decide among themselves democratically whether or not it's right or wrong for them. Do you know in Kenya today, we can't even hold such a political debate, such a discussion? Because every single time we do, we're rallied by the press, and we have groups in the US saying, if you are up hunting, we will have campaigns that discourage tourists coming to Kenya. This is what I'm talking about. It's creating a local constituency. It's creating the sort of thing that Wangari Maathai has done through women and women's movements to recognize that trees are important as they were in the past, that they're important to you in this community, and you can do something about it. And then I think you've got the entities on the ground, and you've got to give them legitimate rights, legal standing, and this is where the politics comes in, to stand up to their MPs, to stand up to the presidents, and to stand up to the international community. And it's only such time as when you've done that that you're going to have a genuine partnership between the international level, which we recognize as important in conserving biodiversity, and the local level, which are the ultimate custodians of what that biodiversity is going to be.
Let's thank David for his insightful comments.